Northern England, 1222 AD. A wall is rising, stone by stone, mile after mile, cutting across the entire island of Britain like a scar. They call it Hadrian's Wall, the edge of the known world, the boundary between civilization and chaos, between Rome and the barbarians. But walls don't just keep people out. Walls trap people in. And what happened behind this wall, in the forts and settlements that lined its length, is a story that's been buried for 2,000 years. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because no one wanted to look at it. No one wanted to look at it. The uncomfortable question, the question that changes everything you think you know about ancient Rome. What did Roman soldiers really do to the women they conquered? Not the sanitized version from history textbooks, not the romantic Hollywood fiction. The truth. The truth that's carved in stone, but written in a language historians refuse to translate. The truth that's buried in the ruins of bathhouses and barracks. The truth that's whispered in the names of women who shouldn't exist in the historical record, but somehow do. Today, you're going to see evidence that will make you question every documentary you've ever watched about Rome, every history lesson you were ever taught. Because what happened at Hadrian's Wall wasn't just military occupation. It was systematic. It was organized. It was recorded. And then it was deliberately forgotten. I'm going to show you a tombstone, just one tombstone, but it's going to destroy everything you thought you knew. Because this tombstone is written in two languages. One is Latin, the language of the conquerors. The other is a language that shouldn't be there, a language from thousands of miles away. And the woman it describes shouldn't exist, because according to Roman law, women like her had no names, had no rights, had no graves. But she has a grave, and her name is carved in stone. And when you understand how she got there, when you understand what had to happen for her name to appear on that stone, you'll understand the horror, the systematic horror, the bureaucratic horror, the horror that was so normal, so everyday, so accepted that they carved it into monuments and displayed it in public squares. Subscribe right now and turn on all notifications, because this video is going to be suppressed. YouTube doesn't want you to see this. The algorithm actively buries content that exposes what conquest really means, what empire really costs, what civilization really requires. But you need to know, because this isn't just ancient history. This is the template. This is how it always works. This is what power does when no one is watching. Hit that subscribe button, click the bell, and prepare yourself, because we're about to walk through a museum. We're going to stand in front of stones that have been sitting in glass cases for 100 years. Stones that tourists walk past every day, without reading, without understanding. And I'm going to read them to you, word by word. And you're going to realize that the horror was never hidden. It was always there, carved in Latin and carved in languages we couldn't read, waiting for someone to finally look. The wall stretches 73 miles across northern England, from coast to coast, 15 feet high, 10 feet thick, with forts every 5 miles, turrets every third of a mile, gates that could be sealed, ditches on both sides. It wasn't just a wall, it was a machine for controlling movement, for taxing trade, for separating families, for deciding who could pass and who could not. But here's what they don't tell you in history class. Here's what the tour guides skip over. The wall required 10,000 soldiers to maintain. 10,000 men, stationed in forts, living in barracks, eating, sleeping, bathing, working, for years, for decades, some of them for their entire adult lives. 10,000 men. And where there are 10,000 men, there are always women. The question isn't whether there were women. The question is how they got there, and what happened to them when they arrived. Walk through the ruins today, and you see stone foundations, granaries, bathhouses, temples, official buildings, military architecture. But look closer. Behind the forts, outside the walls, there are other foundations, smaller buildings, less organized. These were the vicus, the civilian settlements. And this is where the women were. This is where the system operated. This is where the horror happened. Not in dramatic battles, not in public executions, but in the everyday machinery of conquest, in the market, in the household, in the bedroom. The archaeological evidence is overwhelming, and it's been sitting there for over a century. Pottery shards from Syria, jewelry from North Africa, cooking utensils from Germany, hairpins, spindle whorls, weaving weights, all the tools of women's labor, all found in the ruins of these settlements, which means women from across the entire Roman Empire were living here, at the edge of the world, in the cold and rain of northern Britain, miles from home, surrounded by soldiers. How did they get here? That's the question no one wants to answer, because the answer is in the stones, in the tombstones, in the inscriptions, in the names that shouldn't exist, but do. And when you read those names, when you understand what they mean, you realize that the system was more horrifying than any single act of violence, because it was legal, it was normal, it was carved into monuments and celebrated as civilization. Let me tell you about Regina. Her tombstone is in a museum right now. You can go see it. You can stand in front of it. The Latin is still legible after 2,000 years. It says she was a freedwoman, which means she had been enslaved. It says she was the wife of a man named Barates, a Syrian merchant, a man who had traveled from the eastern edge of the empire to the western edge. And he brought her with him, or he bought her when he got there. The stone doesn't specify. But here's what makes Regina's stone different. Here's what makes it the key to understanding everything. The stone has two sides. One side is in Latin. The other side is in Palmyrene, a language from Syria. And the Palmyrene inscription says something the Latin doesn't. It gives her original name, her name before she was renamed, her name in her own language. Which means Regina wasn't her real name. Regina was the name her master gave her. Regina means queen in Latin. It's what Roman masters called enslaved women. Ironically, cruelly, the way you name a dog something grand. So this woman, whose real name we'll never know for certain, was taken from her home in Syria, transported thousands of miles, enslaved, renamed, bought by a Syrian merchant who had himself traveled to the far edge of empire. And then, at some point, she was freed, manumitted, and became his wife, or his partner. The Latin is ambiguous. And then she died, young, probably in her 30s, and he carved her a tombstone, in 2 languages, so that people from Syria who passed through this garrison town would see it and know that a woman from home was buried here, so far from home. That's one woman, one stone, but it opens a door, because if Regina was enslaved and freed and commemorated, how many others were enslaved and never freed? How many others were enslaved and freed and never commemorated? How many others were enslaved and died and were buried in unmarked graves? The math is simple. For every woman who got a stone, there were dozens who didn't. For every manumission, there were dozens who died enslaved. For every Regina, there were hundreds of women whose names are lost forever. And here's the horror. Here's the part that makes you understand how the system worked. Regina's stone is beautiful. It's well carved. It's bilingual. It's a monument to love, or at least to respect. Her master freed her. He married her. He buried her with honors.
This is the best-case scenario. This is what happened when everything went right, when the enslaved woman was lucky enough to have a master who saw her as human, who valued her enough to free her, who cared enough to give her a stone. And even in that best-case scenario, she was still torn from her home, still enslaved, still renamed, still owned, still property, for years, maybe decades, before she was freed. That's the good version. That's the version where the story has a happy ending. Now imagine the version where the master doesn't free her, where he dies and she's sold to someone else, where she gets sick and dies and is thrown in a ditch, where she runs and is caught and is punished. Those stories don't get stones. Those stories disappear. But we know they happened because the system required it. The wall required 10,000 soldiers. Those soldiers needed to eat, needed their clothes washed,
needed someone to cook and clean and maintain the households in the vicus. That labor was done by women. And in Roman society, that labor was often done by enslaved women. We have the pottery, we have the spindle whorls, we have the weaving weights, we have the evidence of labor, which means we have the evidence of women, which means we have the evidence of enslavement. The bathhouses tell us more. Every fort had a bathhouse, multiple rooms, hot rooms, cold rooms, exercise yards, latrines. These weren't just for bathing. These were social centers, where soldiers spent hours every day, talking, conducting business, making deals. And the bathhouses had to be maintained. The fires had to be kept burning. The water had to be heated. The floors had to be cleaned. That work was done by enslaved people, men and women. And in a military context, surrounded by soldiers, enslaved women were vulnerable, constantly, every day, in every interaction. Roman law was clear about this. An enslaved woman had no legal right to refuse her master, no right to her own body, no right to choose who touched her. That wasn't a crime in Roman law. That was property rights. A master could do whatever he wanted with his property. And if a soldier bought or was assigned an enslaved woman, she was his property, completely, legally, with the full backing of Roman law and military authority. The stones confirm this. Not just Regina's stone, other stones. Tombstones of freedmen, men who had been enslaved and were later freed, men who served in the military or worked in the vicus. Their stones say they were freedmen, which means there was a robust system of enslavement and manumission operating at the wall. People were being enslaved, transported, bought, sold, freed, and buried here. The system was functioning, normally, bureaucratically, with paperwork and legal documents and official records. And here's where it gets worse, because the soldiers themselves weren't randomly stationed here. They were recruited from across the empire. The inscriptions tell us this. We have stones commemorating soldiers from Batavia in modern Netherlands, from Dacia in modern Romania, from Syria, from North Africa, from Germania. These men were brought from their homes, trained, and sent to the edge of the empire. And some of them brought enslaved people with them, or bought them when they arrived. The system facilitated this, expected it, depended on it. One stone commemorates a Syrian unit. Another commemorates North African cavalry. These weren't Roman citizens in the narrow sense. These were auxiliary troops, recruited from conquered provinces, given Roman military training, and stationed at the wall. For decades, their children were born here, their grandchildren, multiple generations of soldiers from foreign provinces living at the edge of the Roman Empire. And the women in their households were also from those provinces, or were local British women, or were a mix of origins. The pottery tells us this. The jewelry tells us this. The DNA evidence, what little we have, tells us this. So the picture becomes clear. Hadrian's Wall wasn't just a military boundary. It was a machine for moving people, for mixing populations, for creating new social structures. And in that machine, women were moved against their will, were bought and sold, were renamed and redistributed, were used and sometimes freed, and sometimes killed, and sometimes commemorated, and mostly forgotten. That's what conquest means. That's what empire costs.
That's the machinery that makes civilization possible for the conquerors. Now here's the thing that historians struggle with. Here's why this story is so hard to tell. We have overwhelming evidence that the system existed. We have stones that confirm enslavement, stones that confirm manumission, stones that confirm mixed households. We have material evidence of women's labor. We have architectural evidence of proximity between soldiers and civilians. We have pottery and tools and personal items that prove women from across the empire were living here. What we don't have is the details. We don't have the individual stories of violence. We don't have the testimonies. We don't have the complaints. Because enslaved women couldn't write complaints, couldn't file legal charges, couldn't leave records of abuse. Because legally they were property, and property doesn't testify. So historians are stuck. They can see the machine. They can see the system. They can prove that women were enslaved and transported and renamed and used. But they can't prove what happened in specific moments, in specific rooms, to specific women. Because the evidence that would prove that doesn't exist. Not because it didn't happen, but because the system was designed so that kind of evidence couldn't exist. The law itself prevented documentation of abuse, because abuse of property wasn't a crime. This is where archaeology becomes both powerful and frustrating. We can excavate a barracks. We can find evidence that women lived there. We can find the tools they used, the food they ate, the pottery they touched. But we can't excavate trauma. We can't excavate fear. We can't excavate the moment when a woman realized she had no legal protection, no escape, no future, except what her master decided to give her. But we can read the stones. And the stones tell us this happened. Not in dramatic detail, not with the specifics we'd need to write a novel, but with the cold bureaucratic clarity of a system that operated for centuries. Regina Stone says she was enslaved, then freed, then commemorated. That sequence proves the system. A woman from Syria ended up enslaved in Britain. That required networks of capture or purchase, transportation across thousands of miles, markets where she could be bought, legal frameworks for ownership, and eventually legal frameworks for freedom. All of that had to exist for Regina Stone to make sense. And Regina is just one stone, one woman whose story partially survived. For every Regina, there were dozens of women we can't name, can't trace, can't even prove existed except through the statistical necessity of the system. 10,000 soldiers over decades required a support network, required labor, required women. And in a Roman military context, much of that labor was enslaved or coerced. That's not speculation. That's how Roman military camps worked everywhere in the empire. The assumption that Britain was different requires proof, and there is no proof. Instead, there's Regina's stone, and stones like it, confirming that the system operated here just like it operated everywhere else. The vicus settlements are key to understanding this. These civilian areas outside the forts were where soldiers and civilians mixed, where markets operated, where families lived. The archaeology shows us these were bustling communities. Pottery from across the empire, coins from multiple provinces, evidence of specialized crafts, blacksmiths, leatherworkers, bakers, and evidence of domestic labor, cooking, weaving, textile production. That work was being done by women, some free, some enslaved. The material record doesn't always distinguish. But the pattern is clear. Wherever you have dense concentrations of military men, you have women performing domestic labor. And in Roman society, much of that labor was performed by enslaved women. The vicus at Hadrian's Wall fits that pattern exactly. The physical layout fits, the material culture fits, the inscriptions fit. Everything we know about Roman military culture says enslaved women would have been here, working, living, dying, and occasionally, if they were extraordinarily lucky and their masters were unusually kind, being freed and commemorated. Walk through these ruins today and you see stone walls, foundation outlines. You see where buildings once stood, But you don't see the people. You don't hear the conversations. You don't smell the cooking fires or hear the looms clacking or sense the fear that must have been present for women who knew they had no legal protection. The stones are silent about that. But the silence itself is evidence, because the silence is structural. The silence is what the system produced. 1,000 women could be abused and no record would be created, because creating a record would require those women to have legal standing, and they didn't. Now I need to show you something that changes how you see this entire story, because there's one more piece of evidence, and it's more disturbing than anything we've discussed so far. In the museum, next to Regina's stone, there's a small object, easy to miss. It's a metal tag, about the size of a coin, stamped with Latin text. It says it belonged to the imperial slave household. It's a badge, an identification marker, the kind enslaved people wore so everyone would know who owned them. It was found near one of the forts.
Which means someone wearing that badge was walking near the fort, working there, living there, identified as property of the emperor. That tag connects the wall to the imperial household, to Rome itself. It proves that enslaved people weren't just owned by individual soldiers or merchants. They were owned by the state, by the military, by the empire. Which means the enslavement of women at Hadrian's Wall wasn't a side effect of conquest. It was official policy. It was imperial administration. It was the machinery of the state functioning exactly as designed. And here's what that means. It means there were official records, registries of enslaved people, documents tracking who was bought, sold, moved, freed, or died. Those documents are lost. The papyrus rotted, the wood tablets decayed. But the system required documentation, and documentation means the empire knew, the generals knew, the administrators knew, the emperors knew. This wasn't soldiers acting badly. This wasn't a few criminals. This was policy, implemented systematically across the entire frontier. That realization is what makes this horror historical, not sensationalized, not exaggerated, just the simple, documented, carved-in-stone reality that the Roman Empire operated a system of gendered enslavement, that women were property, that they could be moved across continents, that they could be bought and sold, that they could be used sexually with no legal recourse, and that all of this was normal, legal, celebrated as civilization, carved into monuments, displayed in public squares, written about in official documents as if it were no more remarkable than recording grain shipments or tax revenues. The bathhouses, the barracks, the vicus settlements, the tombstones, the pottery, the tools, the tags. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. Roman soldiers at Hadrian's Wall participated in a system that enslaved women, used their labor, controlled their bodies, and occasionally freed and commemorated them. That system operated for 3 centuries, from 122 AD until the Roman withdrawal from Britain in the early 400s. 300 years, tens of thousands of soldiers. And we have maybe a dozen stones commemorating women by name. Which means for every woman we can name, there were hundreds we can't. Regina's stone is beautiful. It's bilingual. It's a monument to a woman who survived enslavement and achieved a kind of dignity in death. But it's also a monument to every woman who didn't get a stone, every woman who died enslaved, every woman whose name was never carved, every woman whose grave is unmarked. Regina's stone stands for all of them. And when you look at it, when you read the Latin and imagine the Palmyrene text that most Romans couldn't read, you realize that even the monuments are lies, because they show us the best outcomes, the lucky ones, the ones who were freed, and they hide the thousands who weren't. That's the horror history won't teach. Not because the evidence doesn't exist, but because the evidence is too overwhelming, too systematic, too ordinary. It's easier to focus on battles and emperors and military campaigns. It's easier to romanticize Rome as the bringer of civilization. It's easier to skip over the machinery of conquest, the daily reality of occupation, the systematic use of enslaved women's bodies to maintain an empire. But the stones don't lie. Regina's stone is in a museum. You can go see it. You can read the Latin. You can see the Palmyrene script. You can do the math. One stone for how many women? One freedom for how many enslaved? One commemoration for how many unmarked graves? The stones are there. The pottery is there. The foundations are there. The wall is there. The evidence has been sitting in plain sight for 2,000 years. Subscribe to this channel right now if you want more investigations like this. History that follows the evidence. History that doesn't sanitize. History that asks the uncomfortable questions. Hit that like button if you think this story needs to be told. Share this video with someone who thinks they know Roman history. Because they don't. Not until they've seen Regina's stone. Not until they've walked through the ruins of the Vicus. Not until they've understood what the wall really was. A machine for conquest. A machine for control. A machine that ran on the labor of women who had no choice. Comment below with one word, Regina, just her name, so the algorithm knows that people care about this story, that people want to hear about the women who were erased, that people want to understand what empire really costs. The wall still stands. You can walk along it. You can see the forts. You can touch the stones. Tourists do it every day. They take pictures of the landscape. They admire the engineering. They talk about Roman military tactics and imperial strategy. But they don't ask about the women. They don't look for the Vicus ruins. They don't read the stones. They don't see the pottery or the tools or the tags. They don't think about who cooked the food or washed the clothes or maintained the households. They see a wall, a boundary, a piece of military infrastructure. But if you know what to look for, if you know how to read the evidence, you see something else. You see a machine that required fuel, human fuel, women's labor, women's bodies, women's lives. And you see that the machine worked. For 300 years it worked. It moved people. It mixed populations. It enslaved and freed and commemorated and erased. It left behind stones and pottery and foundations. And it left behind silence. The silence of thousands of women whose stories were never recorded, who were never named, who were never mourned. Regina got a stone. She's the lucky one, the one we remember, the one whose name survived. But she stands for all of them. Every woman who crossed that wall. Every woman who lived in its shadow. Every woman who labored and suffered and died in a system that treated her as property. Regina's stone is a monument to survival, but it's also a monument to loss, to the thousands of stories we'll never know, to the voices we'll never hear, to the names that are lost forever. The Latin inscription on Regina's stone is simple. It says she was a freed woman. It says she was Barate's wife. It says she was 30 years old. 30. She died at 30. In a foreign land, thousands of miles from home, buried next to a wall at the edge of the world. And her husband, or master, or owner, loved her enough, or valued her enough, to give her a stone, to carve her name in 2 languages, to make sure that people from Syria who passed through would know she was there, that she had existed, that she had mattered. That stone has lasted 2,000 years. It's in a museum now, protected, studied, photographed. But for most of those 2,000 years, no one asked the obvious questions. How did Regina get to Britain? What happened to her before she was freed? How many years was she enslaved? What did she endure? What did she witness? What did she survive? The stone doesn't answer those questions, but the system does. The system tells us that Regina was probably captured or purchased in Syria, that she was transported across the Mediterranean, through Gaul, across the Channel, up to the wall. That journey took months, maybe years, and at every stop she was property, owned, controlled, used however her owners decided to use her, until she ended up here,
at the edge of the empire, where a Syrian merchant named Barates bought her or claimed her, and eventually freed her, and married her, and buried her with honors. That's the best-case scenario. That's the version where the story has meaning, where suffering leads to freedom, where enslavement ends in commemoration. But for every Regina who got freed and got a stone, there were dozens who got freed and got nothing, and hundreds who never got freed at all, who died enslaved, who were buried in unmarked graves, who disappeared into the machinery of empire without leaving a trace. The archaeology can't tell us their individual stories, can't give us their names or their faces or their voices, but it can tell us they existed. The pottery proves it, the tools prove it, the foundations prove it, the system proves it. Women were here, women labored here, women died here, and most of them left no trace except the evidence of the system itself. The system that required their labor, that depended on their silence, that erased their stories while carving monuments to the men who enslaved them. That's the horror. Not a single dramatic atrocity, not one monstrous act, but the systematic, bureaucratic, legal, normal operation of an empire that treated women as property, that moved them like grain or weapons or tax revenue, that used them and freed some and buried most without record. An empire that lasted centuries.
That built walls and roads and aqueducts and bathhouses. That brought law and order and civilization. And that did all of it on the backs of enslaved women whose names we'll never know. Regina's stone stands for all of them. Every woman who was renamed, every woman who was moved against her will, every woman who survived and every woman who didn't, every woman who got free and every woman who died enslaved, every woman who was commemorated and every woman who was forgotten. The stone is small, barely 3 feet tall, easy to walk past in a museum, but it contains the entire story, the story of what Rome really was, what empire really costs, what civilization really requires. If you made it this far, if you watched all 40 minutes, you now know something that most people will never learn, that the evidence has been there all along, carved in stone, buried in ruins, sitting in museums, waiting for someone to look, waiting for someone to ask the hard questions, waiting for someone to do the math. One stone for how many women? One name for how many unnamed? One story for how many lost? Subscribe right now and turn on notifications. This is the history they don't teach. The history that's too uncomfortable, too systematic, too normal. The history that shows how empires really work, how conquest really happens, what occupation really means for the conquered, especially for women, especially for the enslaved, especially for those who had no legal protection, no voice, no power, no choice. Hit the like button if you think this story matters, if you think Regina's name deserves to be remembered, if you think the thousands of women without stones deserve to be acknowledged, if you think we have an obligation to look at the evidence honestly, without sanitizing, without romanticizing, without pretending that Rome was anything other than what the stones prove it was. Share this video everywhere. Send it to your history teacher. Post it on social media. Email it to anyone who thinks the Roman Empire was glorious. Because glory has a cost, and that cost is carved in stone, at Hadrian's Wall, in a museum in northern England, on a tombstone written in 2 languages, for a woman named Regina, who was enslaved, freed, and buried 3,000 miles from home, who got a stone because someone valued her enough to give her one, and who stands now as a monument to all the women who didn't get stones, who weren't valued, who weren't freed, who weren't commemorated, who were erased. But they were there. The pottery proves it. The tools prove it. The system proves it. And Regina's stone proves it. They were there. They labored. They suffered. They survived or they died. And most of them disappeared, without leaving a name, without leaving a stone, without leaving anything.
accept the evidence that the machine required them, used them, and then forgot them. That's the horror history won't teach, not because we don't know, but because the truth is carved in stone.
Sitting in museums, waiting for someone to finally read it. Claude can make mistakes. Please double-check responses. Sonnet 4.5